Hey guys, it's Nate here. Today what I want to do is expand on a few of my past videos where I talk about approaching long complicated questions and writing long complicated SQL queries. What I want to do is show you guys how I go about solving complicated data science type of questions that have multiple real world scenarios that you need to code into your solution, as well as edge cases that you need to compensate for. All right, so I hope that all makes sense. I have the perfect example for you guys. So let's take a look at this question. But before that, if you guys like data science type of content, please subscribe to this channel. All right, with all that being said, let's start coding. All right, so let's take a look at this question by Amazon. It's called Marketing Campaign Success. So the question reads, you have a table of in-app purchases by user. Users that make their first in-app purchases are placed in a marketing campaign where they see call to actions for more in-app purchases. Find the number of users that made additional in-app purchases due to the success of the marketing campaign. And then the details of the marketing campaign eligibility. This reads, the marketing campaign doesn't start until 1 day after the initial in-app purchase. So users that make multiple purchases on the same day do not count, nor do we count users that make only the same purchases over time. So the same products that are purchased over time. So what I like about this question is that this is a question that will most likely come up at work. But this is actually a pretty difficult problem to solve. So what I'm going to do is break down the solution into multiple components and then go in depth with an explanation of each component. So if you totally understand what I'm explaining in a particular component, feel free to just fast forward to the next section or the next part of my solution. So in terms of approaching a complex question like this one, I'll usually break it into 3 different distinct phases. So the first phase that I go through is to take a look at the data and try to identify all the edge cases and scenarios that I need to accommodate for and implement in my solution. That's actually the hard part that's going to take the most amount of time. Second, once I have an understanding of all of the edge cases and scenarios that need to be implemented into the solution, I can then start to map out the approach on how I would address each individual scenario or edge case. So that's number 2. And then number 3 would be to make sure when I code up the solutions that really for every code block, every snippet or every subquery or CTE, there's really only one business rule that's implemented in there, or one edge case or one real life scenario. So this keeps the solution really clean and distinct from each other, or like the business rules distinct from each other, so that it's really easy to come back to your code at a later time and just refactor the code to make it more cleaner, more efficient. Or if the rules for, say, a marketing campaign have changed, you can then layer on additional rules or exclude or remove other rules that have already been implemented. So it's really important that your code is organized. Okay, so the biggest reason why this question is so complicated is because it has many different types of scenarios that need to be implemented. So the main scenario here is actually at the bottom. The marketing campaign doesn't start until 1 day after the purchase. So users that make multiple purchases on the same day do not count, nor do we count users that make only the same purchases over time. So what this translates into is, to be considered to be part of this marketing campaign, a user needs to buy a product that isn't the same product as what they bought on their first purchase date. So what this translates into is that your product needs to be different, and then the product needs to be purchased on a different day. It can't just be purchased on day 1 and only on day 1. That actually sounds simple enough. Let's take a look at the underlying data to understand what we need to come up with the solution and if we are missing any edge cases or scenarios in our solution. So if I hit this preview right here, we get the user ID. Created at is a date field. The product ID, so we can tell whether or not the user purchased a different product. The quantity of the products purchased and the price. So the quantity of the price are not going to be needed. We really only need to know the user, the date of purchase, and the product purchased. So the first step in my approach is to identify all of the real life scenarios and the edge cases that we need to consider in the solution. So the first scenario to consider is a user buying one product, one item on one date. So this user would not be eligible for the marketing campaign. Another scenario to consider is multiple different products, but one date of purchase. Again, this user, according to the question, would not be considered to be part of the marketing campaign. Another scenario to consider is that the user purchases one item or one product, but across multiple days. So they buy the same product across multiple dates. And then another scenario is that a user can purchase multiple products across multiple days, but the same products were purchased on the first day as were purchased on the future dates. So again, this user would not be eligible to be part of the marketing campaign. So a final scenario to consider is that a user purchases multiple different products on multiple dates, and they should be part of the marketing campaign. So if this was an interview, I would go through each of these scenarios with an interviewer so that they can understand like what I'm actually thinking, what scenarios I want to build into the solution, and what scenarios I'm considering. I would then ask the interviewer if there's anything I'm actually missing. And from my experience, interviewers are more than happy to give you a little bit more information in case you're missing anything. Because what you've done was basically outlined 5 different scenarios and edge cases that you would have to consider to properly code up a solution. And so you've already demonstrated your ability to think through a question and come up with a proposed solution. So on the job, you can actually just validate a lot of these scenarios by cherry picking users in the data set. But on an interview itself, you often don't have a working database and underlying data to take a look at validating all of these scenarios. So it's even more important to communicate these scenarios and edge cases to your interviewer and explaining to them how you're going to approach solving this question. But since we do have a data set on this platform, let's actually cherry pick some of these users so I can illustrate what these scenarios look like in the data set. Okay, so we have 5 different scenarios to consider. So I'm going to pick 5 different users and just show you in the data exactly what it looks like. So we have the table name marketing campaign. The user ID is user 28. So if you run this query right here, we see that user 28 made one purchase on January 27th, 2019, and they bought product 101. So again, to be considered part of this marketing campaign, you need to have purchased multiple products across multiple days. So here we only have one product and one day, so this user is not eligible or to be considered to be part of this marketing campaign. Okay, so let's move on to the next scenario. Multiple products, but one date of purchase. That would be user 49. Okay, so user 49 bought 4 different types of products on the same day. So this user, again, will not be eligible to be part of the marketing campaign because you need to have purchased multiple products, but also across multiple days. So let's now move on to the third scenario. That is one product purchase across multiple days. So that would be user 50. If I run this query here, I get 4 different days, but all the same product, 118. All right, so according to the eligibility criteria for this marketing campaign, this user is not eligible for that. So if you go down to now the 4th scenario, multiple products across multiple days, but same product as the first day of purchase. So let's look at user 25 to illustrate this scenario. So what we have is one user, 3 different dates, and we have 2 different products right here, 114 and 115. This user, user 25, basically have purchased the same products as they bought the first time around. So this user is not eligible for a marketing campaign. So now the last scenario, a very similar scenario, multiple dates and multiple products. So if we take a look at user 46, we again get multiple dates and then we have different products. So the first 3 dates or first 3 purchases were for product 1 or 2. And we see then the user on March 10th and on March 11th purchased product ID 103. And this user is part of the marketing campaign. So when I look at all of these scenarios right here, and then I look at what the general description of the marketing campaign says, I think what we could do first is implement these 2 rules here, which is that the product needs to be different and the products needed to have been purchased across multiple days. The implementation of these 2 rules will actually handle multiple of these scenarios that we have here. So let's do that first. Okay, if we do a quick select star from the table marketing campaign and run the query, we basically get the entire table. So what I can do to implement this rule, the product needs to be different, so we need to have multiple different product IDs. I can add this to the having clause. So having a count that's distinct from product ID, and when you count them up, it just needs to be greater than 1. If I run this, I should get all product IDs where it's greater than 1. But I can't just run this code as it is because each row has just 1 product, right? What we really want to do, what we're trying to do is group by the user ID. So what we need to do is just put the user ID here and then do a group by. And if we run this, what we get are all of the users that have purchased multiple products in this data set, right? But this by itself to debug is not very helpful because it's just a list of user IDs. So what I could do also is just do a count of product ID. And then what I get is a list of user IDs and the number of different products that they've purchased. And you'll see that all of the numbers here in this right column, they're all greater than 1. Along the same vein, I also want to count different dates. So the product needs to be purchased on different days. So that could be another having clause. So by then placing this count on distinct created at dates, I now am filtering for users that have purchased products across multiple days. And I can actually then just output that as well. And they're all these numbers are greater than 1. And so if you take a look at the user IDs that we were looking at when we were describing the scenarios, if you look at the first 3 users, 28, 49, and 50, you won't see them in the output here because these users have been filtered out with this rule right here. They must have bought different products and needed to be across different dates. All right, so implementing this one rule basically takes care of most of your scenarios. But there's still these 2 user IDs, 25 and 46, 2 scenarios that we need to handle to be able to complete this question. What I'm going to do is comment this out. So if you look again at user 25, the scenario that we need to handle with this next implementation is a user bought multiple products across multiple days, but they bought the same product throughout their entire purchase history. So again, if we look at user 25, I'm just doing a select star from the table. We see that the user does indeed have 2 different products that they purchased and 3 different dates that they purchased these products on. But when you look at their first purchase, which is these first 2 rows here, January 22nd, 19, you'll see that they bought both product ID 114 and 115. So when you look at the last 2 purchase dates, these last 2 rows, you also see the same products being purchased. So this user should not be eligible to be part of the marketing campaign. We need to figure out a way to remove this scenario from the output. So an interesting way to do that is to create additional variables, like concatenating different columns together to create a unique string, and use those to filter out data in your output. All right, so let me show you what I mean by doing that. So what I'm trying to do in this implementation is to identify a user's first purchase or first purchase date, because I care about the products that they purchased during their first purchase date. If I just reuse this code, I'm gonna delete the where clause. Again, what I'm interested in identifying is the user's first purchase. So I can use a rank here over a partition So we're going to be using a rank over a partition by the user ID. And then within that user ID partition, I'm just going to list the purchase date, the created at column from earliest date at the top all the way to the latest date at the bottom. And then the last thing I want to do is concatenate the user ID and the product ID, because what I care about is identifying what products a user actually bought. So if we filter for user ID 25 and run this code here, what we get is the original table, the first 5 columns, and then we get the rank and the user product concatenation. So what I'm seeing in the output is user 25 purchased 2 products, 114 and 115, on the very first day. That's why the rank is 1. Their original first purchase were these 2 products here, and then their future purchase is this 3rd row here, and then their 4th row. So for the purpose of tracking both their first purchase and the products that they purchased the first time around, we have everything we need. So using this logic here, what I'm interested in saving is the user's first purchase history, so rank equals 1, as well as the products that they purchased. So in order for me to implement that, what it could look like is essentially select user product from, and then this whole thing becomes a subquery here. I'm going to remove user 25, alias it with an X, and I'm going to say where rank equals 1. So I'm only going to be taking their first purchase. And so what I have when I run this query is a list of all of the products that a user has purchased during their first purchase. So again, if I look at user 25, I see that they purchased products 114 and 115. Now to put everything together, what I want to do is combine what I wrote, the logic that I wrote, with the above logic that I wrote originally here. So I'm going to uncomment this code here. So to keep things kind of clean, I'm just adding some comments about what I'm actually doing in this code. So to put these 2 queries together and to handle the last 2 scenarios here, because we've identified the user and the products purchased, what I want to do with this query here is remove these users from the output. And to actually implement these 2 rules, these 2 queries here will be part of the where clause of my new query. So this new query is going to say select. So what I want to say is where the user ID is in, and basically the first part of this where clause is saying that we want to identify users that have purchased multiple different products across multiple dates. So we want to make sure that this rule is implemented and we're identifying the user IDs within this input here. So what I can also do is remove these counts because they're not necessary. And then to fold this logic into the main final query, what I want to do is remove these user products from the output. So I can say basically the opposite, and the concatenation between user ID and product ID is not in. And then this becomes my subquery here. So when I incorporate this logic into the main query now, it's basically going to be removing every user's first purchase. So now if I run this query with these 2 logical statements that we built, what I want to look out for are whether or not I'm able to handle user 25 and user 46, right? So we don't want to see user 25 in this output. And we don't. It goes from 22 to 43. So that's good. So we see user ID 46 here. We see that they purchased product 103 across 2 different dates. Okay, so now to finish this question, all we want to do is count the number of unique user IDs. So that'll be distinct user ID to see how many are eligible to be part of the marketing campaign. And if you check the solution, our solution is correct. So this was a very complicated SQL question, but it's also a very real question that you could get on the job and maybe on an interview itself. So on the job, it's a little easier because you have a lot of time to think about all of the different edge cases and scenarios to implement, and you have data that you could use to pick out a few users and see whether or not your implementation or your solution is actually working. It's much harder on an interview because you don't necessarily have underlying data or even a working SQL IDE that tests things out. So it's really, really crucial to talk to the interviewer so they understand what you're thinking and how you're going to approach the solution. And remember, the cleaner the approach, the more organized you are at just organizing and separating your logic and business rules from each other, the easier time you're going to have communicating that with the interviewer and the easier time they're going to have understanding what you even mean. Because this is a pretty complicated question to answer with multiple scenarios that you need to implement in your solution. All right, so I hope this was simple enough to follow. Hopefully you guys understood like how I was approaching this question and the framework that I used to essentially answer this question. If you do have any questions, feedback, or comments, please leave one of those three in the description below. So thanks for listening and see you at the next video.